All right, everyone. I'm gonna just take a breath. So happy everyone's here. We're really looking forward to sharing with you guys today. And I'm gonna let my wife kick it off, and we're gonna be kind of tag teaming back and forth here. So if you have questions, you're more than welcome to kind of stop us through the presentation. But we trust you'll be blessed, and we trust you will have a lot of questions. So I'll let my wife kick it off.
So welcome everyone, and we are delighted to be invited to Courageous Conversations. And one of the things that we wanted to do is give you an overview of where we're going tonight. And so can I just say I'm so excited about the title Courageous Conversations, because sometimes conversations are pretty scary. And in our country, any conversation about race and its history with slavery can be pretty uncomfortable for people. So I just want to applaud just the fearlessness of having this conversation and having many conversations. So I'm going to go over just the background of how we got started in doing this kind of work with looking at the history of slavery within the city of Charlotte, specifically within the Presbyterian Church. And then we'll move into the creation of our Community Engage project, which has many moving parts. And then we'll turn it over to look at the ministerial part, and then we'll end by talking about the designs and things that are happening right now in our city in collaboration with multiple educational institutions about having, once we have the conversation, what do we do? What kind of substantive steps can we implement after having conversations? So the first thing I'll say is I've been in Charlotte since 2005, and I have been a stated supply minister within the Presbytery of Charlotte. So that means for over 18 years, I've been preaching at different Presbyterian churches all around the city. Well, when I was thinking about my second book project, I thought, what can I look at? So I always was curious when I would go and preach at predominantly Black churches and predominantly white churches across Mecklenburg County and even in South Carolina. I was always curious about the cemetery. There was always this one part of the cemetery that had a stone wall or a hedge or just a tree. And I would see gravestones or just pieces of stone sticking out, and they look really old. And so I would say to the people that invited me, I said, hey, what's on the other side of the wall? And they would say, well, those are where the slaves are. And I said, come again? What do you mean? And then a couple of times when I would preach, I would go in and I would, after service, I would go in and actually look into these cemeteries and realize that I was seeing the same surnames in the cemetery, in the slave cemeteries that I was seeing on the more manicured side. So then I had all these questions going on. So one of the things about Sardis is, as I began to start the research project, I began to notice that there were 7 historical white Presbyterian churches in Mecklenburg County. And those 7 white Presbyterian, predominantly white Presbyterian churches birthed a number of other predominantly white Presbyterian churches. So if you know your church's history, you actually came out of Providence. Now there's some other records where there was a worshiping community here in 1819, before there was ever a church building. And they were meeting around this area. But a large group of people came out of Providence around 1797. And so Providence is one of those founding sister churches. So as I begin my preaching routes and I begin to look at the segregation that was still going on connected to Charlotte's Presbyterian churches, I decided I'm going to do a book project about it. Now, when I first decided to do that, I had found your church in the records, and I had found your connection to Providence. I had also found those other 6 sister churches that are connected to Providence. Some of you probably know them: Sugar Creek, Steel Creek, Rocky River, Popular Tent, Hopewell. All of those were some of the founding Presbyterian churches. Those Presbyterians who founded those churches, they came down from the Great Wagon Trail, which actually, if you go and stand right in the middle of Trade and Tryon, you're in the middle of that Great Wagon Trail. And those Scotch-Irish settlers, they came down from Virginia, Philadelphia, and came after the Revolutionary War and began to settle here in what we now know as Mecklenburg County. So as I began to do the research, and as I kept preaching on Sundays, I began to piece together the puzzles of how Presbyterian churches were connected to each other, and also how they shared in faith, in life, how they intermarried with each other. There are almost 10 families that decided once they settled here in Mecklenburg County that they were just going to intermarry with each other. So sometimes as a historian, it's a paper trail and a rabbit trail that goes in different circles. But the other thing that was fascinating about the history was that every time I would find a surname, I could look at an African American Presbyterian church and see the same surnames. So now I had many, many questions about the history. So when I finally got started, this was back in 2021, right after the pandemic, I wrote a paragraph and I said, hey, these are some of the questions I have. These are some of the links that I'm seeing between what we call the 7 sister churches and the 14 African American Presbyterian churches that descended out of those. The chair of my department was incredibly supportive, and she said, well, go ahead and we'll support you. So unbeknownst to me, I didn't know I was going to have a community engaged part of my research. I thought I was just going to be in the library and writing these narratives down. But if you're a good historian and you want to confirm your data, you actually have to go to the cemetery and look at the gravestones to see if people say that they actually died on a certain day or they actually were born. So every time I went back into the cemeteries, I was like, there's something going on here beside me getting information. There was such a stark difference between me going through the very manicured spaces and then going into these very neglected, overrun with foliage spaces. And so as an ordained Presbyterian minister, what do? I didn't call committee first, right? I actually prayed. And I said, Lord, I'm feeling something as I step back and forth between the manicured and the unmanicured. And I said, what would you have me to do? And he said, well, why don't you try to bring back the memory of those who were enslaved? Why don't you try to create equity? Now, the day that I had this conversation with the Lord was today, the day that I went to one cemetery and the manicured lawn people, the lawnmower people were out there. And I was waiting for them to go and do the lawn care on the enslaved side of the cemetery, but they never did. And so I thought, oh, there's inequity. For years, I bet that lawn care group had been going to that church, and they've been always doing the very manicured side, but no one has ever said, hey, can you go clean up the leaves around this stuff? So that began my journey. So the first church that I decided to say, hey, would you consider thinking through your church's legacy? And their burial ground was Providence Presbyterian Church. They were incredibly gracious. They had a Boy Scout troop that was doing some of that work already. And I realized that as I was looking at different churches like Providence, lots of the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts had already begun sort of doing the work of trying to create equity. Now, I don't know whether they thought that they were doing equitable things, but the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and Sunday school leaders were very aware that there was another part of their burial grounds. And so these are some of the churches around the city. Providence is the gate, the one that you see if you're facing, it'll be on your far left there. That's how the cemetery looks. And you can see that the Boy Scouts put a little trail there. There's some crosses as you look around. But still, and there's other churches that you see where there are people who have tried and done some work but haven't finished the work. So it's not like enslaved burial grounds are off the radar of some Presbyterian churches. They've been there, but there hasn't been a sustained focus. And the other thing I noticed is that when churches did decide to pay attention to those enslaved burials, and as part of their church's history, very few of them reached across the divide, the racial divide, to the Black Presbyterian churches that were connected to their ancestors buried on the land. So there are unfinished conversations. In fact, it takes courage to go to the church down the street or 5 or 6 miles from you that you know have their ancestors buried in your enslaved burial ground and say, hey, I'd like to have a conversation with you. That's an uncomfortable conversation because the legacies of slavery are pretty hard. But Providence decided to do that. And so last year, I presented the project to them. And then as I was working on the project with Providence and they said yes, I happened to meet Reverend Allison. And I was following a rabbit trail and I ended up at the cemetery of Lloyd Presbyterian Church. It was a cold February morning and the Presbytery of Charlotte was doing a cleanup of Lloyd's cemetery. Okay. And so Reverend Allison came up and she said, hey, I think we might want to do something or connect. We have an enslaved burial ground. So the conversation started way back in like 2021, 2022. And then here we are today where we've been maybe 3 months into this, it's 2 months into the conversation, and Sardis is taking that courageous conversation like Providence is doing to, number one, address the enslaved burial ground as you've done before, and also to have a deeper conversation. So in the past, because of the Boy Scout and Hoke Thompson and your historian, David Blackley, you have done lots of work with recognizing the enslaved burial ground and putting up some memorials. And the African-American gentleman in the middle there of everyone is Jimmy Kirkpatrick, as you probably well know. And so Sardis, I found, was a little bit ahead of Providence, and that not only had you had the conversation, but you've also started inviting some of those descendants to that conversation. Our team and the Equity in Memory and Memorial Project wants to deepen the conversation that you've already started. And for me, as a historian, writing about the history of Charlotte and writing about the history of slavery and Presbyterianism, I'm excited because I don't want a book that just talks about the legacies of slavery and Presbyterianism. I want a book that ends with what Presbyterians, both Black and white, are doing to have courageous conversations about that history and to do substantive work after those conversations to say, we heard the story, we lamented on things not right, and we're doing something to be transformative in our community. And so for us, as you look at how we call it the E2M project for short, because of the two M's that you see, memory and memorial, for us, it's about community building. Some of the conversations that are being had between representatives from each church have been conversations that have never taken place. Think about it. Usually, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Presbyterian, born and raised, but usually, and I come from a predominantly Black Presbyterian church, that the only time that we gathered with white Presbyterians was with the triennium, when all the youth would come together, Martin Luther King, when there would be his holiday, when there would be a pulpit swap, and maybe community Thanksgiving. So maybe 3 times out of my experience as a Presbyterian looking at the culture of churches, there's very few moments where Black and white Presbyterians come together to talk about the history of slavery, and let alone talk about their church's history. So here was a moment where I was finding churches that were willing to do that conversation. So part of that conversation was talking about what it meant to partner with the E2M project as they looked at their enslaved burial grounds, and also as they looked at the history connected to their church. So I'm going to let my husband come up in just a minute to further flesh this out, because he's my project manager and partner and ministerial partner in this. But one of the things that we are finding is that many of the African American communities that came out of Presbyterian churches, they don't know where their ancestors are buried. Some of them, for the first time, are just learning that they're buried over at this church or in that church. What's happening with your church, with Sardis? The research is showing that Sardis Presbyterian, after the Civil War, the enslaved people, number one, did not leave all at the same time. They left the church in waves after the Civil War. Many of those Presbyterians that were baptized in your minute books as recognized members, that were questioned by the session on their faith and commitment to the Lord, many of those Black Presbyterians left, and they went to Ben Salem Presbyterian Church. They went to Lloyd Presbyterian Church. And I was just telling Reverend Allison that we did not know that the day that we were cleaning up Lloyd Presbyterian Church, we did not know that we were standing on some of the ancestors that may, and the descendants of the ancestors that may have been buried in Sardis's graveyard. Many of your enslaved descendants also became members of what we now know today as Matthews Merklin and Greer Heights, right? Greer Heights was started later. There are 2 other churches that your church's membership went to. Weeping Willow African Methodist Episcopal Church and Antioch Baptist. So Sardis's history is fascinating, because you are just not moving your history around the legacies of slavery. You're also looking at the migration of your Black Presbyterian members who went and started numerous churches. And for the Presbyterians, they still kept your church polity, your church government, the worship styles, and worship life. And if I did a little radius, these churches some of them are less than 10 to 15 miles away from this land. So Sardis has a really rich history connected to the enslaved burial ground. And what the E2M project wants to do is, number one, support the exploration of that history, and also bring those communities together. And so right now we are working with Ben Salem, we're working with Greer Heights, and we're working with Matthews Merklin. And so those churches will eventually come together with your leadership that's part of the E2M project, and we will eventually sit together and think about how to deepen the memorialization work that you've already done to recognize those members as part of your church family. So that's where we're going. I'll let my partner Ricky come up and finish up.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sweetie. So actually, can you go back one slide? Just go back one slide. Because I want to just take a moment to highlight a couple of things. Yeah. So the project itself, Equity in Memory and Memorial, was, an amazing brainchild, I should say, of my wife. And there have been so many different things that have come together to really allow this project to take off. But I wanted to take a minute and just kind of go through some of these items here to be sure that you guys can kind of capture what's going on with the project. So the memory part is definitely going back and looking at Charlotte's racial past with the goal of affirming our common humanity. But this memorial part, like Julia mentioned, we really are trying to bring representatives that we call leader advocates, which I'll explain more in a little bit. But we get these representatives to come to the table and actually work together on what a design would look like to memorialize those formerly enslaved people. And they're really representatives. The leader advocates are representatives from each church. They're really the ones who are speaking, they're praying into, they're discussing what actually this design should look like. And this is the part that I really wanted to just kind of hone on for a moment. Sometimes I have to remind my wife that this is really, really big deal that she's doing this. And it's important for people to understand that there's a tangible impact. There's an immersive learning experience for the students at UNCC. They actually come on the land and they're there doing different things. In Providence, as an example, we had a ground penetrating radar survey done by a very well-known archaeological team. And so the students actually got a chance to come on site and get trained on how that actually took place. And that was actually part of the survey that was done there at the cemetery at Providence. And so it's extremely important. And there's this collaborative effect of things happening at UNCC. It's not just my wife teaching a class and those students coming. There's also archaeological students that are involved. There's also an archaeological history class that's involved. There's this team teaching effect that's going on there in UNCC, and it's an amazing experience. And actually, we're going to have some of the students out at Providence tomorrow doing some design kind of investigative. Thursday, yeah, not Wednesday, yes, Thursday, doing some investigative work out there. So there's this immersive effect for the students. And trust me, it's a powerful experience. Some of the students are emotionally set back when they actually come on the land. Some of them are, more energized to do something. So it's a very impactful experience for the students. And then, there is this recognition portion. We certainly want to, whatever comes out of the findings, we want that to be registered, if it isn't already, with the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology. And my wife has already built relationships with that office, the director of that office, and they're constantly sending her referrals, actually. So there's other churches around the county and even as far as Virginia that have been reaching out and wanting to get involved with what we're doing here. So it's extremely involved. And then to actually have these partnerships that take place. Our ministry, which I'm going to get into a little bit more, is really trying to help facilitate helping the leader advocates build capacity to stay at the table when the hard data comes. But there's so much more that's going on. all these other partnerships that you see here with the libraries, both in Atlanta as well as here in UNCC. And then there's this host of professionals and donors. Most of the funding for this project is all coming from private donors. And that's like amazing. UNCC, and I'm gonna give them kudos because they're very, very involved with this. They opened up their foundation department basically, and their business development team has been going around helping to raise funds for this. So it's just an amazing thing that's going on. And we're all here, I think, benefiting from that. So I didn't want to just shy away from that. She tends to sometimes kind of move past those points, but I want you guys to really get that. So just briefly, I'll talk about More Grace Ministries and who we are. Right now, it's my wife and I, pretty much as far as what we're doing, but we've had a lot of people helping us along the way. We actually have our pastor here, Pastor Derek Turner, and many people there on staff that has really helped us to kind of formulate what we're doing with More Grace Ministries. But what we've learned since we started More Grace Ministries back in 2017 is that the Lord just tends to keep us around this racial healing space. And as the Lord started talking to Julia back in 2021 about doing this work within the Presbyterian Church, we realized, actually he told us that there was going to be a need to help the different churches stay at the table, because people were going to have different emotional capacity for the data that was going to be presented and for just their own trauma or their own issues that they've had to live through. So More Grace Ministries became that vehicle to do that. Now, for us personally, Julia and I have spent, and I am not overestimating these hours. I've never calculated them all up, but I've kind of stopped somewhere in the 500-600 range. We've spent hundreds of hours ourselves going through racial healing in different ways, for different reasons over the years. We've had a lot of training from many different organizations. Pretty much all of our available time that we have as far as vacation, with the exception of this past summer, we spent about 3 or 4 days in Paris, which was great. But everything else, we've just been going to healing seminars, we've been taking training classes, and the Lord has prepared us for this time. And I'm going to share with you in a little while some of the things that we go through with the leader advocates and why it's important to take this time to do this. So as we have been working through why are we doing this work, we've put together a why statement that we want people to understand. Why is this important as Christians today for us to do this? And so I'm going to take you through our why statement. So the first one is, every person is born in God's image and likeness. God's design was for all ethnos to live in community. Because we are children of God, we know that the gift that we have been given, being in relationship with Jesus Christ, enables us to live out God's call for love, equity, and unity. Choices that were made in the past that yielded slavery, segregation, and injustice for the formerly enslaved persons are not forgotten. Because we are children of God, we will make compassionate choices that value the equality of all people. E2M is a testament of God's love for humanity and his unwavering passion to not leave us alone to the limits we impose on ourselves. Because we are children of God, we love well, we honor the forgotten, we esteem the least, as we bring equity and memory and memorial to those who were formerly enslaved. So, and we have some foundational scriptures that we put all that around. So that's our why statement. That's what keeps us focused as to why we're doing this work. One of the things that Julia mentioned was she mentioned the 7 sister churches. Well, the charter that she currently has at UNCC is to allow this work to extend through those 7 sister churches and some of the other churches that can be agreed upon, in this case, like Sardis. And there's going to be many years in going through this project. Right now, it looks like somewhere between 7 to 10 years to get all of the work done just with those 7 churches. So this is what keeps us together. This is the anchor of why we're doing what we're doing. So the leader advocate training, and this is the part I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this is important for you guys to understand what we're doing. So everything we do, and there are some leader advocates in the room and they can testify to this, it's all centered on Jesus. There is no way that we're going to have these conversations without him being in the room and us engaging him on a regular basis. That's some of the things that we have seen over the years. All of you, I'm sure, have seen over the years, whether it's with Christians or non-Christians. It's like, why are we blowing up? Why are we deciding that, you know what, this person's against me, that person's against me? Well, you know what, we may still have some of that, but we're going to learn how to tap into what Jesus is saying in the moment and learn how to stay connected with him in these hard conversations. So we spend approximately 16 to 20 weeks working with the leader advocates to go through this material that I'm going to share with you for emotional capacity purposes. These next bullet points, I'm just going to share a couple of items about them. So we spend time on loving attachments. That's really focusing in on God's love for us. That's the first foundational piece that we spend time on. Next one, please. Our identity in Christ. We spend time anchoring our thoughts around who we are in Christ, first and foremost. We add in this element of brain science. There are different things that we've learned over the years that we provide to the leader advocates. We try to sprinkle that throughout all of the training. And like I mentioned, there's about 16 to 20 sessions. Each one's approximately an hour apiece that we have on store for them to go through this material. They haven't gotten a lot of the books yet that we're going to be sending out, but they will be shortly. So the work is going to pick up here pretty soon. But we have some techniques around brain science. We also spend time doing Emmanuel prayer and journaling, basically engaging the Lord on some easy topics, and then we'll get into some tougher topics. Relational skills. All of these things may sound like they're kind of overlapping, and there is a little bit of that going on, but these skills that we're teaching them are things that are going to help, again, build emotional capacity to stay at the table when the data gets tough. Lament and empathy skills. Julia mentioned that earlier about how we will be spending time lamenting, and we have different tools to help people understand how to navigate that space. I want to tell you a quick little story without giving a lot of details, but we have been working with another ministry, and these are people who are very versed in helping to train leaders across the world. And they were talking to us about a problem that they had shortly after one of the racial unrest events that happened back in 21. And the crowd of people that they were speaking with was primarily Black. The two facilitators, one was white, one was Hispanic. And as they started into trying to share with this group these tools that the group actually said they needed, they realized that they were looking at people with just, they were glazed over eyes. Some of them were starting to put their head down in their hands. And as they decided to stop and ask questions of what was going on, a couple of the people actually started saying, you know, I can't get past what just happened last weekend. And it was near their community. And this was a terrible racial event that if I was to bring it up, you all would know what I was talking about. And the leaders of that meeting never were able to go further with that group. They basically lost the group in trying to teach them some things that they, the group, actually wanted. The leaders got on the phone with us about a month later and started asking us Julia and I, some questions. And we just said, well, let's stop and hear what the Lord has to say. And one of the things that came up was this very thing here. We didn't give you, meaning them, didn't give space for lament. The people really needed to lament. And so it's important. All of these things are, I brought that up for one reason, to say this is all very important, and it's important in trying to build capacity to stay at the table, because you don't know what somebody else is bringing to the table, and sometimes you may need to lament for a minute. Some of you all may be aware, and I'm not going to get into the details, but I'm just going to share one thing. Some of you may be aware of the fire burning that occurred at Matthews Merkland not too long ago, right? Well, when we got together, we needed to lament that. There was some significant concerns that many different people had at that table. Nobody had any idea that was going to happen. It just happened. So my point is, things happen along the way. The goal here is to memorialize those formerly enslaved people, those people who never had a voice for themselves, those people who were not treated as human. And so we want to stay at the table, all of the churches together, to accomplish that goal. And so that's why we go through these tools. So I'm going to just take a quick moment to share some things, and then I'm going to turn it over to questions from the audience. So after we go through the 16 to 20 weeks of leader advocate training, we bring all the churches together and we start talking through the design portion of this. Now, the students would have already done a couple of things. One, they would have already done a lot of the historical research at the direction of my wife, and that will be brought to the table as well. If there was a ground penetrating radar done or survey done of the property, the idea is to bring that data to the table as well. And then there is the architectural design component that students get involved, and they actually draft up some initial designs. So all of this information is brought to the table to help the leader advocates start sifting through and saying, do we like this? Do we want this? What's better for this? And so that in itself is a process. Yeah. What's that? Oh, yeah. So I'm gonna mention two people. Dr. Matthew Jin is on our team, and he's one of the, he's the co-teacher, co-professor with Julia doing the architectural historical work as well as some of the design work. And then we actually have a very well-known, at least in the architecture space, and award-winning architect, Dr. Mark Manak, who is actually a part of our group as well, and he's now working on the design for profits. So, and he's already told us that he's in for the long haul with this, so we think we've got him even for this project. So we go through this design stage, there's obviously the build portion of it, and then we wanted to culminate in a presentation to the community, an acknowledgement of the churches working together, and a hope that there will be more there. There's a preservation portion of this, meaning how we're going to move forward and keep this going. We have plans in place for interacting with different organizations across the city, including the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system and others, to actually help enrich people's experience in the community by bringing them out for tours and so forth. So there's a preservation plan as well. The scope of the project, as far as the time frame, we're estimating it take anywhere from 18 to 24 months to do all of this work. So this is not something that we can do in 6 months. So it's an 18, 24-month project. So that's high level, that's quick, but I hope you guys got a good idea of what E2M is about. And if you have any questions, please, now is the time.
Can you further clarify, like for Sardis, I know you kind of referenced it, but will you clarify for those who may not know exactly where Sardis is in terms of this project with you all and the other churches?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sardis, we've got multiple, I think we have 7 now, total leader advocates with Sardis, and we're about 2 months into the leader advocate training. We meet every other week for about an hour, and we're doing the same thing with Ben Salem and Greer Heights. We meet with them every other week for about an hour, and we're about 2 months in with that. And our current estimation is somewhere in the January, February timeframe, we'll probably come together and start working jointly.
Also, in addition to that, in this January, I'll be teaching a course with Dr. Matthew Jen on the history of Sardis with architectural students who work in tandem with history majors and religious studies majors in order to craft and design possible plans and designs to enhance the work that's already been done. And then there will be conversations with the architect. I've also been in contact with Dr. Bobby Arick, Andy Bobby Arick, who did your ground penetrating radar back in 2015, and had conversations with him, looked at some of the data that he had produced back then when he did a GPR. And Dr. Bobby Arick said that there were enslaved burials outside of the fence area. And he even said that the ground penetrating radar he did back in 2015 actually indicated that there might be even enslaved burials under the Boy Scout hut. And so I've been in conversations with Dr. Bobby Arick about him coming back out with me and us looking at the land again and seeing if there might be a need for another ground penetrating radar to fully ascertain how many enslaved burials there might be with that. And then also the history that I keep finding is unfolding with more and more of your church's connection to the Presbyterian and that one AME church and the Baptist church. So that's where the research is going now.
How accurate is the data on the enslaved cemetery? Are you accurately being able to identify families and names and those that were members of the church? I mean, how accurate is it?
So in terms of accuracy, ground penetrating radar can give a number up to around 90% of accuracy about that there are enslaved human beings that are buried in that part. In terms of actual family names, there's only a few fieldstones that have names on them, But what the students and I do is we triangulate ground penetrating radar data with the historical records of the church. And so, for example, in Providence, I think on their historical marker, they had 40 names of enslaved people identified. But when we did ground penetrating radar on that site, it was over 205 enslaved burials on their land. And so what we did with that was we triangulated with the historical data of the enslaved members' names who were registered as baptized members or communicants. And then we sort of contextualized that GPR data with the history of enslaved people there. So even if we decide to do a GPR here again, we would be triangulating the names of the enslaved on the Sardis minute books with what the numbers that are there, and they might be less or more. So, and I have to say, I've been in your archives even today, and I don't know whether you have a complete list somewhere else, but I'm just finding enslaved people all through your minute books from 1840s to 1850. So there's, the names are there. We just have to kind of highlight them and recognize them.
So several times you mentioned that things can be difficult if data starts coming in. So what's some of that difficulty that you have to be ready for?
I'll start and
Okay.
I'll pass them. Let me just start with my students. So some of my students don't have any relatives connected to the enslaved burial grounds that they visit. But when they get on the land and they see the very stark distinctions between the ways in which they were memorialized, and some of them are forgotten, there's a lot of sadness. There's a lot of anger that some students have about the inequities that they see. And so it's important to sort of give space for where students are. And most of my classes are multiracial, meaning that they are people, not just Black and white, but they're people from other ethnicities. And they just come in and they see just the stark inhumanity of memorialization and difference. And so for students, that's those are the things that can come up. For church members, that you can add that experience. There are stories of, for example, members of Matthews Merklin who did not know that their ancestors were buried there. And when they go to see their ancestors, they have to walk through this very manicured lawn and see the way those graves are preserved. And then they step through the gate and then they see the way their ancestors were. And there's no marker to find their ancestors. It hasn't been cleaned and preserved. And so if you can imagine, if your loved one has been neglected or you didn't know where your loved one was, and then when you find them, you see that others have been taken care of and remembered and your loved one hasn't, those are the emotional things that could come up. But when we, in churches, we can partner with Jesus and his presence to help us stay together and mourn and celebrate the positivity of coming together and finally doing the memorial.
Let me just add one other comment to that, to you. So the other piece of that is that, generally when things are difficult, and maybe generally is too strong a term, but a lot of times when things are difficult, some of us anyway have been taught to just put it down and keep going. Just press it down and keep going, get it done kind of thing. And what we're learning and what we're attempting to share and teach is how not to do that. Because it doesn't allow for the Lord to get his point across, whatever that is that he wants to share. We've learned that that's not the way he likes to operate with us. He wants us to open up and be transparent with him and not just push things down, because what ends up happening is somehow that thing will come out. Sometimes it's not so good, sometimes it's tolerable. So our hope is that when the data starts coming, like some of the data that Julie just mentioned, you don't know how people are going to respond. Some people might not have an issue with it. Other people may have a big issue. As an example, when we gave the information to more of the congregation, it wasn't all of the congregation at Providence, but they invited us for a Sunday school session, and there was probably as many people in this room that was there. When we told them the number, that it wasn't 40 plus, it was 205, there were people with their mouths dropping. They were just stunned by it. And some of them came up afterwards and, you know, they did different things. They apologized, and it's like, they were not part of the leader advocate group, so they didn't get a chance to really hear our heart about that kind of thing and understand how to navigate that space. But for the leader advocates who hear that, we communicate how to navigate that space and how this isn't about shame and guilt and frustration as to why this happened per se. No, that's not where we land and stay. And so that's part of this capacity building piece. The key piece of this is knowing how to connect with Jesus and hear what he has to say about the moment, because we're all unique, we're all complex, we all come from different things that have impacted our life. But he's the one anchor, and he's the one person who knows exactly what's going on with each and every one of us. So our goal is to help people stay connected with him when the day gets tough. Yes, sir.
One of the things that stands out from the short distance I've made on this journey as an advocate is that you don't take the attitude that the upsets you to get over this 160 years ago, move on. But we stop and not say that, but listen, understand those are kind of much, much different than where I was with. We're on one side of the fence, folks on the other side of the fence. Sometimes we've got to figure out a way that when the going gets tough, we don't cut the other way out. We keep the door open so
Any other questions? Sorry.
I just want to say that's so wonderful and well said, because as Christians, we are all about healing the wounds in the body of Christ, and racism is a wound that has kept division. And so this work is really about bringing the body of Christ together on an issue that really has been a long time healing.
A question really about, this is going on in this area. Is anything like this going on in different parts of the state? When I think about North Carolina, historically, the Randall County area, there were many slaves there. The eastern part of the state, we think about when the state was being settled, that this is Charlotte. But all these other areas, is anything like that going on in these other parts of the state?
Okay. All right. So thank you. So the question was, is anything else like the restoration or recognition of enslaved burial grounds being going on any place else across the state of North Carolina or even the United States? And I can say yes, there are organizations that are popping up in lots of places. I'm thinking, and some of them are connected to universities and smaller colleges. However, we don't know of an organization that is attempting to bring the descendants of the enslaved and those who enslaved people together to process, to come together and tell the truth, and then to do substantive kinds of honoring and repair. And we certainly don't know of any organization that's bringing churches together to do that. There's maybe some community groups that are bringing a couple of people. We don't know of any organization that is being directly focused on bringing the descendants of those who were enslaved and the slave owners together to try to have a courageous conversation like we're having, but also to do substantive steps for healing and unity. But yes, there are lots.
I just wanted to add too that the way the Lord has been moving on this, things have been really picking up very quickly. And it's something, and we're giving him all the credit for this. The kind of exposure this project is having it's kind of mind-blowing to us because it's getting national attention and we're able to share it even internationally. And when we talk to people who are in those spaces, they come back and they tell us this is a pioneering work. So in some ways, this is just getting started.
Oh, yes, yeah.
What are the qualifications you set up for advocates? I have not heard about anything, I didn't know about this project at all with the church. I'd like to know how you pick advocates and what their qualifications were.
So I'll start and you.
Okay, you go ahead.
So the process is we reach out to the leadership, which is usually the ministers, and then we ask them to suggest people, and we tell them up front that we're looking for people who are willing to step into the waters of this conversation, but also to learn and partner with the presence of the Lord, because we are specific about how deeply prayer and engaging and hearing the voice of God is in this process. And so that's our first presentation, to say people who are willing to step into these waters and engage.
And then we have a series of like roles and responsibilities that we provide as well to the leaders, the session leaders, as to what a leader advocate would be asked to do. So I didn't bring a PowerPoint for that, but there's like a list of maybe 8 items or whatever that we ask for them to do. But we really leave the selection up to the pastoral staff, the churches.
Any other questions? Okay,
I
well,
have a thought.
all right, yeah.
I just think it's amazing that like Sardis could be blazing the trail on this that could go to accommodate all of North Carolina and then into other states and other places, because I know where you guys are going with this and how amazing would it be for Sardis to be right on the front end of saying, hey, we help navigate this and pioneer it. That would be a special thing, I think, for your church.
Mhm. Thank you for that.
What feedback are you getting from the Black people?
So the question was, what kind of feedback are we getting from the African American churches that are connected to the history of Sardis? And it's been really positive. There have been churches who are excited about finding their ancestors, because many of them have been unable to find them. And they are passionate about engaging the story. And for the first time, there's hope there as well, because in the past, they have stories of their ancestors wanting to be more connected to their white brothers and sisters in the faith, but having Jim Crow racism and all of that in the past separate that. And so this collaboration marks a new opportunity to fully connect with the members of the same faith family. So there's positively, but there's also some sadness, right? Because when they find the way their ancestors were buried or left, or they see the distinction between how different burials were preserved and not preserved, it is very hard for them.
And one of the things I would also add, and this is kind of letting you guys in on some of our prayers. So one of the things that we pray to the Lord about this, we say, Lord, we want people who are that decide to be leader advocates. We want those people to be ones that you have already worked on their hearts. So this isn't something that anybody's kind of, twisting arms or making folks believe that, it's a good work. No, God's been dealing with their hearts before we even came along. Some of them this church as well, but certainly at the African American churches, they've been like, well, we've been doing this and we've been looking for this, and our hope is for that, and God's already been working on their hearts and stirring on their hearts. So they are very much engaged, and so much so that we had to dip back into the well here and ask for more leader advocates because we want the numbers to be pretty much equal. So they're very engaged.
So I want to end with two stories. The first story is about Providence, and a couple of people who are in the room that I shall not point out, but they said that they had been praying, the members at Providence had been praying for some vehicle so that they could reach out and deal with their history, but also reach out to the church that they knew were connected to their history, which was Matthew's Merkland. And so we just came along and they said, oh, we don't know whether you're all our answers, but we've been praying way before you got here about how to connect with the church that we know is connected to our history. And so that was powerful for us because we didn't even know that prayer was going on. The other thing is that when in 1797, when it marks that Sardis grew out of Providence, when they left Providence, they took many of the enslaved African American families with them. And so there was, if you can imagine, those families were broken up. So when the church split, not just church families are broken up, but enslaved people who may have been families that were in the same vicinity, when they left to come and start Sardis, those African American families were broken up as well. And so this work that is going on now is really tracing those family lineages of those African Americans that were sort of split up again or stripped from their families, even in the midst of slavery. They're trying to say, oh, we're coming back together. So that's why I can look in the archives now and see the same surnames at 4 different churches, because I'm realizing those families were owned possibly by other family members. And when they left, they broke them apart. But now 6 or 7 generations later, they're coming back. My last story is one of hope and resilience. There's a member at Providence who shared the history of an African American member's ancestors that she didn't even know. The story is they were sitting in church, and when they heard the name of their ancestors, the Providence affiliate member was able to be with her in that moment when she heard for the first time her ancestor's name. Now that's a powerful moment, and what a healing moment, because this African American woman had been looking, trying to figure out who her ancestor was, and she found it at this other church. And when she heard that ancestor's name, she was together with the person that helped find it. And so there's so many stories of healing and hope and community that is coming out of this. I don't have time to tell you about family reunions that have been transformed because the white slave owning family told the truth about their history and reached out. And the Black family who was part of that history reached out in forgiveness And they both came together and celebrated their unity as a family, even though they had an incredibly hard history. So there's forgiveness, there's hope, there's love, there's resilience that comes out of this project and of this research, and that's only by the power of God. But I think the Lord wants to do many, many more moments of that in the body of Christ to show how we are all one in Christ Jesus.
Thank you all.
I just want to thank you all again for being here, for incredibly powerful presentation and conversation with us. I'm indeed a conversation starter, and I think one thing that's just been lifted up for me is I've always been told, you know, the Presbyterian Church is a connectional church, and we talk about that in a lot of other ways, right? When you go to Triennium or Montreat, you see somebody else that you know, and they know somebody else that you know, and you make those connections. But it's pretty powerful to think about all the many different layers of connection that we have just in our own community. So I'm excited about those possibilities. I did want to share and further clarify, I probably should have said this in my introduction as well, but back before we even started thinking about leader advocates and being a part of this program, and somewhere in between the time that we met with some of the other Sardis folks, some of y'all I think were even there with me at the cemetery cleanup that we joined together with the Presbytery a couple years ago, and we started hearing about the startups of your project work here. So it's been ongoing different conversations and different people in this. And then Ricky and Julia came and made a presentation to share about this with the session, maybe last summer or so, maybe in May. And so the session received that presentation and was able to reflect on that and discern, and then decided, the session of Sardis decided that they wanted to be a part of this partnership in this project. And so the journey has kind of continued to unfold from there. And the mission ministry of Sardis has helped to, so each of the partner churches who are in these conversations together are asked if they're able to contribute a certain amount to the work. You can see all the many layers that are going on in this kind of project. So the mission ministry of Sardis, from a gift trust fund that we have discerned and session approved that to use money from part of our mission ministry gift trust to help support this program. So there's been a lot of different pieces in the room, but it sounds like we can even, the point of this is to help more of us understand and know what's going on, even though we've tried to share it a little bit through some of the mission publications and whatnot. But we really look forward to the work going on, and what our leader advocates will also, they're going to be tasked with then coming to help us figure out how we engage too, not only with our partner churches, but also how we share and create more conversations amongst even just here at Sardis. So thank you all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Please be sure to fill out the evaluation form that's on your table, or reflection form, or look for that to come to you online. And if you have other questions that come up later, please, Anne, can I have them send those to you, or who should they send their questions to?
Send them, they will come, they will confirmation. Email.
So you can email Anne Shove, who helped organize this conversation tonight, or of course you can email one of the pastors if you have a question or whatnot, and so we can help continue the conversation. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.